Hello, I'm Father Bart Giger, and welcome to week 3 of our 9-week prayer novena at Boston College, using the letters of St. Ignatius Loyola for prayer and reflection. Our theme this week is poverty. It's something that Ignatius writes about to a Jesuit community in Padua, Italy. Now, when Ignatius writes about poverty in this particular letter, he's not referring primarily to the poor, the economic poor who suffer in our society. He's referring first and foremost to the attitude, the spiritual attitude of poverty, simplicity, surrender, indifference, that ideally Christians and others should be practicing in their own lives, precisely in order so that they can enter into a deeper sense of solidarity and love with the economically poor, and also, of course, with God. Okay? So Ignatius writes this beautiful letter in 1547. Well, technically he didn't write it. His secretary, Father Juan Polanco, wrote it, but Ignatius gave him the bullet points of what to communicate. And so we know that it does accurately reflect Ignatius's thought. And there's a tremendous amount of beautiful content in this letter that will easily take up a week of your own prayer and reflection if you wanted to. And so what happened was, the Jesuits had a benefactor all lined up for them in Padua, Mr. Lipomani, and he was going to pay for their housing and their food and whatnot. But for various political reasons, his donation fell through, and the Jesuits didn't have any other benefactors to fall back on. And so these poor guys for the next year suffer very serious deprivations. They're really struggling to put food on the table and to find warm clothing and things of that nature. And there's no light at the end of the tunnel, and there's not much that Ignatius can do to solve their situation. And so what he does is has this letter sent to them in which he's trying to communicate to them and remind them of the deep sense of meaning and purpose to what they are going through, to remind them that this is part of the reason why they made a vow of poverty, was to be able to embrace and experience opportunities like this. Okay, so Ignatius is trying to inspire them to look at their situation in a new way. Okay, so it's helpful to remember that in the spiritual exercises, Ignatius talks about this kind of poverty in two ways. He talks about spiritual poverty, which he says ideally is an attitude that all Christians should have. And spiritual poverty means I am willing to accept or reject, to let go of anything in life solely on the basis of whether or not I believe that it will serve God's greater glory, that it will bring me and as many other people as I can closer to God, to edify as many as possible. Okay, so for example, if I can edify the greater number of people by having this money over here, then I'll take it. But if I don't really need this money to serve God's greater glory, I have the freedom to let it go. This material item, if I really need it to serve God's greater glory, I'll use it. If not, do I have the freedom and the courage to let it go? This particular relationship, it might be a fun and enjoyable relationship in many ways, but if I don't get the sense that it's really edifying me, and if I'm not edifying the other person, if this is not for God's greater glory, as enjoyable as a relationship might be in its own terms, am I perhaps willing to let that relationship go? Okay, and so among other things, if I choose this course of action over here, I know that I will edify a tremendous number of people, but I know that others are really going to mock me and ridicule me in public. Do I have the freedom to accept that, to accept the mockery and the abuse, because I know it's for God's greater glory? Okay. Or conversely, if I choose this course of action to serve God's greater glory, but I know that everybody's going to start calling me a saint, even though I know I'm not, okay, do I have the freedom to let them call me a saint? Okay. For Ignatius, the overriding criterion is always what is going to serve God's greater glory. Okay. That's the one end, keeping our eye on the ball, that pure intention that we should be looking at. There's a great line, St. Thomas More, he didn't really say this, but in the play, A Man for All Seasons, there's this wonderful line where he says, sometimes we have to do the right thing, even at the risk of being heroes. Okay. And so that's kind of what Ignatius would have had in mind with its principle and foundation. Do I have the freedom to do this thing or accept this thing, even if it means others are going to think well of me? Okay. So now, actual poverty, Ignatius is going to say those who really want to demonstrate their love and their generosity to the Lord are going to go even further. It's not simply going to be a willingness to accept or reject whatever God might ask of them, okay? But it's actually proactively asking God, Lord, all else being equal, if it serves your greater glory, I am asking you to experience perhaps deprivations in my life, suffering in my life, ridicule in my life, whatever it might be. I'm actually asking you to experience these things, provided that it serves your greater glory. Now, why in the world would anyone ask for those things? You know, admittedly, that can sound a little creepy. That can sound a little dangerous, right? To ask God for those kinds of things. But there's a couple different things going on here. And one is, you know, you can look at it this way, say, well, Lord, I'm asking to experience these things so perhaps someone else doesn't have to. You know, nothing in this life is ever accomplished without great sacrifice and suffering. And so, Lord, perhaps in order for your greater glory to be accomplished, let it be me. So perhaps it doesn't have to be someone else, okay? But also, when we deeply love someone, we want to enter into their reality. We want to experience a sense of solidarity and union with them, precisely to show our love and to give them support. Okay, you know, a beautiful example that I tell my students about all the time. If you go online, you will find stories, all kinds of stories to this effect, of people who they have a loved one who is suffering terribly, and they do something to actually try to enter into their loved one's experience. So, for example, I got this off the internet years ago. This young boy had cancer, and he had an operation which left him with a very ugly scar there on his head. As you can imagine how traumatic that would be, how sad that would be for any young man, any boy, okay? His father loved him so much that he freely chose to have a permanent tattoo etched on his own head in the shape of his son's scar to show his son how much that he loved him, okay? And so in that sense, you could say that the father freely chooses this humiliation, so to speak, this suffering, in order to enter into that solidarity with his son. Here's another example I took off the internet years ago. This young woman had cancer and had lost her hair from radiation treatment. And her boyfriend, in order to show his love for her, had his head shaved, okay? You know, in one sense, he can't do anything to take away her illness, but what he can do is show his solidarity and his love. And in that sense, give her strength and support, okay? There's a Jesuit here at Boston College who says, I remember he taught us once years ago in class, he said, the best way to define Christian mercy, it's a willingness to enter into the chaos of another. What a great line. Isn't that what Jesus did at the incarnation, the first Christmas? He enters into our chaos. He enters into our messiness. Okay. And so in this letter from Ignatius to the Jesuits, he's going to talk to them about poverty in two senses. He's going to talk about the nobility of poverty and the practical benefits of poverty. Now, again, when he says nobility of poverty, he's not talking about the economic poor, like it's good to be economically poor. That's not what he means. He's talking about the nobility of this interior disposition of poverty that Christians ideally should be practicing, okay? And so in the same sense that it's the nobility of this man's gesture of what he did, okay? And so Ignatius is going to tell these Jesuits, never forget that this experience, even though of deprivation, you didn't choose it. However, if you embrace it, look at it this way, this is your sense of meaning that you're bringing to it, you are entering much more profoundly into an experience of what Christ himself went through in his own deprivations, in his own poverty, in his own need. And so you are going to grow much more deeply in your love for the Lord, and you are experiencing much more profoundly than you ever would otherwise what it means to be like the economic poor who have no choice but to go through this experience. And so the nobility of poverty freely chosen is to demonstrate that deeper love, that deeper communion and solidarity. Okay. But Ignatius is also going to talk about the benefits of poverty, of that attitude of simplicity. And this is an idea that runs through all religions. This is not a Christian insight. It's part of what a healthy asceticism is all about. It's the basic idea that as Christians and others, we want to live as simply as possible, to not start to accumulate all kinds of material items and other created goods, okay? Because these have the capacity to really deaden our relationship with God, to distract us from our relationship with God and from other people. Okay. How often we might be tempted, for example, in our lives, when God is inviting us to prayer, we say, well, maybe later, I'm going to go watch my favorite television program. Or God might be inviting us to enter into a conversation with our family members or our friends, and yet we kind of flee from that communion because we have something that distracts us on the side. Okay. And so we all have had the experience, many of us, I know I have had the experience of, if you eat too much at dinner, you just kind of feel blah afterwards. You just kind of feel like you don't feel like doing anything. You just kind of feel lethargic, right? Well, in the same way, if we accumulate too many things, rely on too many things besides God, all right, it makes us spiritually sleepy. It makes us spiritually lethargic. And so Ignatius is going to tell the Jesuits, look at this as an opportunity to really cultivate your virtue and your sense of unity with God, your prayer life, okay? And it will heighten your ability to reflect and to think critically, okay? And it will heighten your appreciation of what the poor go through, all right? So it raises our consciousness. And so in this letter for this week, I would invite you to perhaps bring to your prayer and reflection, one, are there ways in which the Lord is calling me to live more simply? Do I really need this item or reality or whatever it might be in order to grow closer to God and to his people? And if you do need it, great, keep it, use it. But in an honest, courageous discernment, do I also have the freedom to let it go if I don't really need it, or if it's distracting me in some way, okay? And of course, also ask ourselves, what can I do to cultivate that deeper sense of solidarity and union with others, especially the poor, and especially now the African American community in the United States? Are the things that I have chosen, the ways that I choose to live, do they unwittingly isolate me, kind of deaden me to the reality of their truths and their experiences? What can I do to show that greater sense of love, that greater sense of solidarity? Because once again, as I said before, as Ignatius says over and over, we're all in this together. We're here for each other, to bring each other home. Thank you very much. God bless you, and I will see you next week.